Before World War II, Warsaw was the center of the Jewish population of Europe. Jews had lived there for over 500 years. By the eve of the war, fully 30% of the city was Jewish. In 1939, the Germans conquered Poland very quickly, and World War II began. The Germans had planned to deport the Jews. However, the plans didn't immediately succeed, and so, as an interim measure, Jews were concentrated in cities and near railways, and these became ghettos. The ghettos were not an end in and of themselves. They were interim measures, again, on the way to deportation and then later on to mass murder. Once the ghetto became a reality, the Jews trapped inside were its prisoners. They could no longer come and go freely as they wanted to. They literally went to bed one night and woke up the next morning surrounded by walls. And now at the entrance to the ghetto stood very intimidating symbols of authority, German guards and Polish policemen. Any Jew who was found outside the ghetto was unceremoniously shot. The Jews were sealed inside the ghetto. In September 1941, a German soldier who was stationed in Poland, named Heinz Jost, snuck into the Warsaw Ghetto with a camera, even though he was not authorized to take pictures there. Jost took over 150 pictures of the escalating chaos of the life and death in the Warsaw Ghetto. 1941, the year when Jost took the pictures in the ghetto, represents a kind of midpoint in the life of the ghetto. It had been about a year since the ghetto was established, and it would be almost another year until 300,000 of the Jews in the ghetto were taken and murdered at the death camp in Treblinka. At this point in time, the Jews were still struggling to survive the horrific conditions in the ghetto. And yet, as we will see, they had managed to build a society behind the walls of the ghetto with educational institutions, cultural institutions, and mutual assistance. The most significant thing that can be seen in this picture is the overcrowding. There are many, many people walking around, but they're not walking on the sidewalks, they're walking in the street, and that's because there's actually no room. The population of the ghetto reached almost 500,000 people in the spring of 1941. The ghetto was so crowded because this huge amount of people, which was like a small city in and of itself, was crammed into just a few streets. As a matter of fact, many diarists wrote about the pushing and the shoving and the filth and the dirt of the city streets. There were some streets that were even one-way streets only for pedestrians because of the catastrophic overcrowding of the ghetto. In the photo, we can also see someone who is staring out her window at the crowded ghetto streets below. Coincidentally, Chaim Kaplan, who is an educator in the Warsaw Ghetto, wrote about exactly the same situation in his diary on November 17th and 19th, 1940.
The congestion is mind-boggling. If you stand on a balcony and look down on the ghetto streets stretching in front of you, you see nothing but a vast expanse of human heads, the ebb and flow of waves of tens of thousands of people. Almost everyone is dressed in the same manner, nothing elegant, and every face wears the same expression of Jewish sorrow, which has hardly changed since we were turned into dust. We will molder and rot within the narrow streets and the crooked lanes in which tens of thousands of people wander idly and full of despair.
The overcrowding in the ghetto was so catastrophic that on average 7 to 9 people shared each room, which meant that people were living with strangers. The cacophony and the stifling atmosphere led people out onto the streets, but the jostling crowds were there as well. In this photograph, we see Jews riding in rickshaws, which was a very unique method of transportation that was used by the Jews in the ghetto because cars and vehicles were banned. This was the way they had to deal with their restricted reality. But what we don't see in the photo speaks volumes about the life that they were forced to build. Encircled by walls, the Jews were cut off from food supplies. They had their businesses taken away. They were completely dependent on the Germans for their rations, and those were completely insufficient. They were forced into a reality where they had to smuggle.
The traffic of rickshaws, the Warsaw Ghetto's distinctive means of transport, which the Jews have taken over from the Japanese and the Chinese, they couldn't even dream about fixing up the rickshaws the way the Jews have done. Under the seat there is an empty space where several sacks of flour can be squeezed, and the driver sits on top feigning innocence. I'm just taking a ride down the street.
Illegal smuggling brought in fully 80% of the food that was consumed by the Jews in the ghetto. There were big organized smugglers who quickly became very rich, and they became the ghetto's elite. And there were other types of smugglers. These were usually very small children who smuggled food into the ghettos just to keep their families alive. This type of smuggling really turned family life on its head because it went against the normal fabric of the family and of society. Smuggling was also very, very dangerous. Anyone who was caught outside the ghetto smuggling was immediately and unceremoniously shot. This, of course, created an awful dilemma for parents who allowed their children to smuggle because they never knew whether their children would return. Aside from illegal smuggling, the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto drew on their pre-war traditions of social welfare institutions and tried to set up legal institutions that would provide help for the neediest people in the ghetto. For instance, there were mutual assistance societies and self-help organizations. There were also house committees, which were literally committees that were formed in apartment buildings where they tried to help each other with the problems of the day, including obtaining food. Public soup kitchens were set up so that each hungry person in the ghetto could at least get a bowl of soup every day, even if it was a very meager meal. And Rachel Auerbach, who was a member of the Oneg Shabbat and also a worker in a public soup kitchen, tells us that the biggest soup kitchen in the Warsaw Ghetto was serving 4,000 bowls of soup every day. But if 100,000 Jews had succumbed to hunger and starvation in the ghetto, 200,000 Jews were on the verge of succumbing to starvation. And this raised an awful dilemma, as Rachel Auerbach wrote in her diary.
Soup kitchens had to cope with immense pressure, both internal from the undernourished workers and their families, and external from scores of refugees and unemployed locals for whom a bowl of soup was their only meal. To our regret, the most needy, the truly destitute, could not be saved by a meal of soup. Their bodies swollen by hunger, they kept disappearing without a trace. Whole families, whole communities passed through the soup kitchens and faded away in front of our eyes.
The next picture shows a typical ghetto site. A woman is selling armbands in a street in the ghetto. There are differences between the armbands, but we see that they're all white with a blue Star of David in the center. And that comes from the fact that the Germans ordered all Jews over the age of 12 in the general government, the area of Poland that was not annexed to Germany, to wear these blue and white armbands. The question is, why? These armbands were like a badge of shame, and they were one of the ways that the Germans humiliated the Jews. The order to wear the armbands came before the ghettos were even established. So the armbands were a way of isolating the Jews and separating them from the local Polish population, humiliating them and marking them so that everybody could see them. And this raises the issue of being marked and being humiliated. The armbands for the Jews were like another wall that separated them from everyone else. The experience of wearing the armband was as much an emotional trauma as it was a physical one, as we can see in the piece written by the Underground Press.
The armband. How can one wear it? I felt it burned my arm. It was as if I had to put a collar around my neck. I was gripped by anxiety. I couldn't sleep at night. I smelled danger everywhere. Whenever I ventured outdoors, I looked in all directions. My nerves were always taut.
Behind the woman, we see a wall with posters. If you look carefully in the left corner, you can make out the word Koncert Symfoniczny, in English, symphony concert. On the other side of the woman, we can make out the word theater, also in Polish, meaning theater. We understand from these posters that there was a wealth of cultural activity in the Warsaw Ghetto, which is really amazing if you consider that people were dying and starving and collapsing in the streets of hunger, disease, overcrowding, cold. The fact that in the Warsaw Ghetto there were libraries, there were concerts, there were theaters that were putting on performances really shows how the people in the Warsaw Ghetto were struggling to hold on to life as best they could. Note the philosophy implicit in this attitude. If we continue to read, if we continue to go to the theater, if we continue to listen to the symphony, then we can look towards the future instead of being stuck in the present. We can also escape our surroundings, if not physically, then at least spiritually. Why would people on the verge of death care so much about cultural activity? We see the escalating chaos. We see the ghetto sealed off. We see it being isolated. We see it being flooded with Jews, and we see that they are deprived of everything. We see the hunger, the cold, the starvation, the disease. But we see also that in spite of all that, the Jews still managed to build a life for themselves within the walls by means of their own resourcefulness and drawing on their pre-war values. Less than a year after Yost took his pictures, 300,000 of the ghetto's Jews were murdered at the death camp of Treblinka. In April 1943, two brave groups of fighters rose up and fought against the Germans in an uprising, but they were put down. Shortly thereafter, the Germans came in, wiped out the ghetto completely, and that brought hundreds of years of Jewish history in Warsaw to an end.